I would argue that like most smart founders that apply themselves can get a business to $1 million in ARR. I'd argue if you give those people $25 to $50 million, they can probably get a not very good business to 10 million in ARR.
Yep.
That doesn't mean it's a good business. That doesn't mean it's profitable. That doesn't mean it could ever become a business that generates 100 million or $1 billion in revenue. It just means that like if you spend $1 enough, you can figure out how to extract 20 cents from it.
Hello, fellow data nerds. My guest today is Michael Seibel. Michael is a group partner at Combinator, a managing director of YC Startup Accelerator. He also co-founded Twitch and currently sits on the boards of Reddit and Dropbox. Michael, welcome to World of DaaS.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited. Now, probably, you've seen more data than anybody in what makes a company successful or unsuccessful. Like, can you give us a little taste of that?
One of the things we say to YC founders is that we see a lot more failure than success. So we really try to figure out how to help people not fail, and then they figure out how to succeed. Some of the things that cause failure, let's see. I would say first, lack of a co-founder. Startups are ridiculously stressful. I think people underestimate the amount of emotional stress there is, and just having another person there to share the load. We often joke that when single founders come through YC, especially first-time founders, they end up adopting their group partner as their kind of co-founder, which is not good for them and certainly not good for the group partner. So that's a big one. I think the other big one, I don't think most YC founders who are successful don't have their unique insight pre-launch, and they don't even have the unique insight during YC. And so one of the things we warn people about a lot is your job isn't to just build and scale your thing in your head. Most of the learning hasn't happened yet. And I think that that's really antithetical because, or at least counterintuitive, because you're pitching investors. And so you feel like you should know the right answer. Where when we go through all the YC examples of successful companies, almost none of them knew the right answer at the YC stage.
Is there a certain commonality in founders or something? Probably all of them have like a decent idea. They're in YC to begin with, so they have a decent idea. They're smart people. They're probably all of them are smart people that you're involved with.
One would hope.
Is there some? But some of them are able to like find this great idea through tons of interactions over time. If you think of the Justin TV story where you were, like that was a huge evolvement that happened over time to Twitch.
Yeah.
Some of which maybe aren't able to find it. Maybe it's not their fault. Maybe they're just in a market that's tough. But is there some sort of personality type that you think is more likely to do it, or some sort of type of founder where nowadays you have a higher a rate of success?
So I would say this specific question is hard to tell when we're reading applications or interviewing. When we're working with a company, I would say there are two things. One is simple kind of logical thinking. I find that like the founders who can kind of communicate logically and like not draw conclusions that can be easily disproven with basic logic really helps.
Okay.
Which you would think that's a skill that comes with being smart, but I would argue that like it isn't really. It's a separate skill.
Because there's this other side of founders that people talk about, this reality distortion field that you think would be in tension with that.
Yes. And so I would argue, when I work with founders with the reality distortion field, it is much more likely to not go well.
Okay.
Yeah, much, much more likely. And then the second thing I would say is, and this is maybe just another way of saying the same thing, intellectual honesty. Right? Like people who, when they say they're going to do something, they do it, or like when they don't do it, they just say, we didn't do it. I think that doing a startup is so stressful that, sometimes people lie to themselves, right? You don't want to admit that you didn't make those phone calls, or you didn't send those emails, or you made a a spec list that was way too long, or you didn't write down your spec for the week, so you didn't really build the thing you wanted to. Like those things are embarrassing to admit. And founders who just kind of get over that and are just super honest with themselves, they learn faster. And so I would say that both of those, kind of the extreme honesty and the lack of the reality distortion field, is a very good sign that we admitted the right person.
And those are probably traits that have been true forever. Are there traits that are, you think, more true today than were true a decade ago?
I think that there is a challenge that is more true today, which is that when we were doing YC in 2007, we felt lucky to be doing a startup at all. And so we didn't, I think young people nowadays feel like getting into the startup game is easy. And so they only grade themselves on like how much progress they're making. And if that progress takes time, it's very discouraging. Whereas I would argue that for almost every YC company, it took longer than they thought. It was harder than they thought. The insights happened later than they thought. And so sometimes I see kind of young people today wanting like a payoff that happens in the course of like a semester. It's like, like everything's related to a class. Oh, I started getting it 3 months in. And, we're like, it might be okay if you don't get it a year in. And a lot of young people are like, I can't do that. How would I stay motivated? Um,
Yeah.
and so I think that's a big challenge today versus back in the day. I would say that there's a big similarity. Folks were excited about Rails and building web apps back, this sounds like the dark ages, right? But in the mid to
I
late
remember that
2000s,
2006,
yeah,
2007.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
actual technology was exciting for people. And AI reminds me of that today, where like there are a lot of people who are doing it because who are doing startups because it's their opportunity to play around with the most interesting technology. I'd argue we went through a phase, consumer fintech, crypto, where a lot of the people who are getting into it were getting in to make money, not to have fun, not to play around interesting technology. And, that certainly was a disadvantage.
There's this class of people, and I assume many of them or most of the people in YC are in this kind of world where they've been overachievers all their life,
Yes.
and many of them have not, because they're young, they may have not had an opportunity to experience much failure or much disappointment or many setbacks. Maybe some very small things like they didn't get the Rhodes Scholarship, but they got this other well-known scholarship or something,
It's a
right?
rough life.
Yeah. Or they got into Princeton and not Stanford or something or whatever.
Yeah.
But what uh, what how do you deal with those types of people as they're kind of like running into their first few roadblocks? And is there some sort of predictor? Some of them probably do extremely well with that, and some of them maybe get paralyzed by those situations.
One of the advantages that YC has is by funding people in a batch, you get to see all such a wide variation in outcomes during those months that I think it helps you handle the disappointment. The second thing that I think is really helpful with YC is the number of stories we tell of successful companies. I've always been shocked at how little history founders know. But like, then I think back to myself at 23 and I was like, I didn't know shit. I wasn't researching anything, right? Like, of course not, right? But when you tell people that Coinbase didn't allow people to buy Bitcoin when it launched, they're like, no way. You're like, yeah, like it did. Like, they didn't figure that out. Or like Airbnb didn't collect payments when it launched. They're like, oh shit, like that seems pretty obvious. And so I think a lot of the times kind of seeing people around you fail and recover is the easiest way to feel like, okay, this isn't our game yet. And to see smart people you respect around you not doing well and them stay motivated. I'd say the other thing is that doing a startup's lonely. I remember talking to one founder who didn't do YC and is very successful. But it became clear he didn't have a lot of startup friends because his
Yeah.
relationship with his investors was, a one-to-one relationship. And it was fraught with, I don't want to say the wrong thing, right? Like these people like can really screw me over. And I realized for a YC founder, there's just a whole set of people they naturally get to hang out with who can't judge them. There's no, not on their board. They're not going to write checks. And they can just become friends with them, and they can handle that stress as a group versus as an individual. And this is especially good when, founders are having a dispute. So like you
Yeah.
can't go to your co-founder, but like y'all have friends within the batch. So I think that's kind of a really big help for YC. But even with that, your central point remains, right? If you get punched in the face and you can't get back up, startup world's not for you.
Yeah. Now, if you were starting a YC for 13-year-olds, where you can get a percentage of their lifelong earnings, and you're competing with all the top investors in the world, all the top hedge funds, Point 72 is now in the market, and all these other things, and so you can't just like invest with people with high SAT scores. How do you select people, or is there something like people don't like that you would find like, oh, that's maybe not so bad? Like, I don't know, they got in trouble with the law or something.
Well, I'll say this. I wouldn't answer this question directly. I would never start a YC for 13-year-olds. This is what I will say, though. I remember a story from one of our university LPs where they said, I bet you think you monetize our students pretty well. And I said, oh, yeah, like, a lot of your students come through YC. I guess, we do a good job. And they said, you get 7% of the company that they do that does YC. We get 10% of everything that they make when they die. And I was like, oh my God. Like I'd never heard the university business model like summed up so succinctly.
Yeah, that's a great business model.
It's like, oh Jesus. If you can just wait, 60 years. So I think the universities are probably doing the best job at this kind of program.
Yeah, that's probably true. Now, one thing is, if you think of YC as you can think of YC itself as a venture capital firm, but you also see YC itself as like a business. And
Yes.
where I feel like it's different in venture capital firms is venture capital firms are always advocating for their companies to create differentiated products, but they don't necessarily take those ideas themselves, that advice themselves. Whereas like YC seems to really be the core exception. Like, how do you think about that? The actual venture capital business and YC's place in it.
I used to think that venture capitalists were misguided for not innovating. And being in the innovation industry and not innovating, I used to blame them and say, well, what are you guys doing? That was a lack of understanding. YC's advantage was it was self-funded to start. And the founders didn't need to make their first buck. They'd already sold a company. And by the time we were seriously pitching LPs to fund YC, we already had a successful model. Most funds are built in the exact opposite way. Before they have a successful track record, they have to pitch LPs. And that process kind of forces them into established ways of doing business that are the only ways that they'll get funded. And so I realized like, oh, wow, the system of funding and the fact that like, if you can't self-fund your firm, you really have to do it like everyone else in order to get money, creates this lack of innovation. And it's not surprising that some of the best firms like Sequoia or A16 get a little bit more leeway in innovating, but it's just a little. And I would say YC is extremely different. Like I would argue that YC is the combination of a university, an investment fund, and a software business. And that just doesn't seem to exist out there otherwise.
To push back a bit though, a particular venture capital firm, while they might not self-fund the fund, they usually own 100% of the GP.
Yep.
And the LLC that kind of owns the fund. And so it's almost the opposite of like a particular founder, where a founder has to like take all this dilution. Usually the fund is not taking dilution in the core fund, in the business. In the actual business, they're only taking business in each individual fund.
But to get any investment capital, they have to present a pitch that LPs are interested in.
Yeah,
And if
that's
that
true.
pitch is
Yeah.
too innovative, or if it conflicts with LP strategy, they won't get money.
Now there are a lot of accelerators, but like when I think of like the accelerator university analogy, like if a student goes to Yale or Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, MIT, like they might choose any of those options, and they're all great options. And if they get into one, it doesn't mean they're not going to choose the other. But for accelerators, like it seems like YC is by far the most prestigious. I assume it'd be very rare for someone who got into YC to choose a different accelerator.
Yep.
Like why is that the case where it's so dominant in accelerators, whereas like you can have many great universities or VCs, for example, there's many great, you
Yes.
could get Benchmark and Sequoia and choose one versus the other for many different reasons.
So I'd argue the university analogy might hold, but you might want to look at the population of people who are interested. So, there's a lot of people who are interested in going to university. So there's a lot of potentially good options. If you look at business school, most people would say there are way fewer good business schools than there are
That's
fewer,
true.
right?
Yep.
Because fewer people are interested. And I would argue that, whereas in our world, startup seems huge, in the real world, it's a tiniest of tiny, 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 tiny group of people who are interested. And so it just can't support as many institutions. And so I think that's, the unfortunate reality is that you get a distribution based on how many people are actually interested. And it's pretty rare to want to go through the pain of being a startup founder and the long payoff cycle, right?
Now, the scale of venture capital has changed like massively over the last decade.
Yep.
Is being able to scale up and expand a prerequisite for firm survival, or do you see these like more niche? How do you see that kind of walking out?
I don't know. It's very, very hard for me to think about how a typical VC fund should be constructed because I've never really worked in one, and it's so different than YC. I feel like I'd be giving someone advice without having enough context. I do think that one thing that I'll comment on is that in the zero interest rate environment, I think that everyone expanding their growth funds and writing huge checks into early stage companies didn't help the companies. And I think that we were at fault just the same as everyone else with
They
our growth
basically got
fund.
too much money.
Yeah. And I think that like it's in hindsight, it's somewhat embarrassing what was done, right? Like if you were just to say facts out loud, giving a pre-product market fit company 25 to $50 million ain't gonna fucking help them. Giving,
Yep.
Giving a founder a enough secondary that they can live the rest of their lives and never have to work is going to have an impact on their execution, especially if the company is going to struggle in the future. I think that whole thing was just an embarrassing example of investors, ourselves included, thinking that you could model a business in an Excel spreadsheet and cash is a primary input. I've never seen cash being a primary input in a successful company. It's definitely an input, but it's not the number one
Yep.
most important.
Yep. There were certain businesses that maybe require a bunch of like if you didn't raise the cash, you will die. Like some of these ride sharing businesses or food delivery business or something like
Yep.
that,
Or
where they're
rocket.
extremely rockets obviously, or or something like that. But probably for many others, like the winner was not the one who raised the most cash.
Well, and I would argue even in those businesses where a certain amount of money was a required catalyst, I still don't think that money was the primary mover. For every one of those industries, there were a ton of companies funded and only a couple winners, and a lot of
Yep.
companies got money. So I think that unfortunately, it was crazy to watch it happen because all founders know this, right? Like all founders know if you raise your Series B 6 months after your Series A, you haven't done shit in the interim, right? We all know that, right? But on the other hand, if you're advising a founder and like money is available at 3x the valuation 60 days after your Series A, you're gonna tell them not to take it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's very tough.
It's tough. But like I might argue that for on the order of 80% of founders, that probably was the right decision in the end. There are so many founders now with a ton of cash and no idea what to build.
Well, the other thing is, at least right now, is because it's harder to raise cash, you will have less competition, which also means you have less worry about not raising cash.
Well, and I think that's interesting because, like, I definitely know a lot of companies who have successfully cut their burn. So they have tons of runway. To your point, they're not going to have a lot of competition. But I would still argue that, like, by far the hardest thing is to figure out what customers want and to build it for
Totally.
them, right?
Yeah.
And it's like you can get all those other things right. You can have all the cash and the good
I've struggled
hiring.
with that of everything I've ever done. Yeah.
Yes. So, sometimes I think it's like, I always think about this like, I say to founders, what item on your to-do list makes your stomach hurt when you look at it? You should probably be working on that one. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of founders kind of go to, and myself included, it's easy to go to item 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 on the list and ignore
Well, because
number
we want to
one.
check it off. We're all in that kind of like, we got to check off the list, inbox
Yes,
zero type of thing, right?
exactly. But like if item one is like by far the most important item and you never work on it, we're about to see a lot of that.
Now, if you were like gonna create a competitor to YC, like, is it like some sort of like really nichey thing? Like we're gonna do something like an accelerator in like this crazy niche area, or or do you think it's even possible to do it? Like, how would what are you worried about as someone who's in YC?
I would say startup accelerators are generally not good businesses. I would say that, YC started in 2005. But, if anyone bothers to go out there and do the math for a second, like a lot of the big IPOs literally happened, 15 years later.
Yeah,
And so I'm always confused when people want to compete in the accelerator model, especially if they're not like already rich, because it's not it's a pretty hard way to make money, I would
yeah.
say. So I think that if I were interested in doing something else in the startup world, it would not be starting accelerator. No, no.
What do you think about these incubators? We had Jack Abraham from Atomic on World of DaaS. Like, how do you think about these incubators? There's not that many of them that have been successful, but what do you think about the incubator model?
I think that I will say this. I think that startup investing is very different depending on what scale you're doing it at. And I've certainly seen people do it at very small scale with their own money and work with a very small number of companies and see some amount of success doing it. I think the tricky thing is it still takes forever to pay out, and like that model breaks at scale. And
Yeah,
usually the people who are rich want to make something at scale. So it's this
yeah.
constant kind of battle. Um, but I
Like
think
if you
that
did, one every 2 years, it's one thing, but if you start doing one every 2 weeks, it's a whole other
it's a
thing.
different thing. Yeah. And so
Yeah,
I definitely see people, I think the people who are doing incubators as kind of like their lifestyle fun thing, I think that's probably the right idea. I just don't think that model scales, unfortunately.
yeah. Okay, interesting. Now, one of the things I admire about YC is that because the hard thing in all these financial firms is the CEO handoff.
Yep.
And YC is still relatively young company. I don't know. You at least have had like 4 CEO handoffs, I think, right
Yeah.
at this
Yeah.
point, which is 4 more than most venture capital firms have ever had.
Yeah.
Like, is that just like baked into like the founding? Like, how did that happen?
That's a really good question. I think YC has a hidden advantage that people don't realize, which is um, the people who are partners at YC, for the most part, were YC founders.
Yeah,
And so there's a huge part about working at YC that's about giving back to the institution that kind of gave to you, as opposed to kind of extracting from it. And I think kind of in a normal corporate environment, it would be nice if people felt like they were trying to give more than they were take. But I think the reality is people are trying to take more than they give. And
yeah.
so that makes a lot of these issues a lot harder to deal with. But, if you've already, you're a group partner at YC, you've already sold a company, you're doing it to give back. I just think that's like a way more, that team has way more foundational strength And I think that's really, really important. I think the other thing that's important is we think about YC way more long term. You know, the reason why I was interested in working at YC was because I think it can thrive for 100+ years. And I've already been shocked to see that the lifespan of the companies that all my friends started and the ones that we're funding now is fairly short in the end of it. And so the opportunity to work for an institution that can be thriving 100 years from now is somewhat unique. And so you want to treat it with respect.
It is interesting that, like, I think most people who are familiar with Y Combinator cannot name the CEO of Y Combinator. And I think that's a feature, not a bug.
Well, and I think this is a way where we're a little bit more like a university. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know the current, I went to Yale. I don't know who the guy,
Provost
maybe I
or
know who the
president or
current
whatever.
president is. Yeah. Like,
Yeah.
but it's not even something you think about as the primary
Correct.
thing, right?
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Good point. I have no idea who the head of my university is currently. Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Now, you're a big proponent of the MVP concept that founders should focus on getting out some sort of minimal viable product as soon as possible and then kind of iterating.
Yep.
Where do you draw the line between like bad rushed product and MVP, or how do you kind of think about those?
I think this whole debate is missing the point. I think that when you think about bringing on a new employee in a company, oftentimes you want to deliver some type of emotional win to them pretty quickly. So you put them on the bug fixing team, or you give them a small task, right?
Customer success or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Service.
And the reason why is because you want to get them into a pattern of launching and then learning. And because you assume that their true kind of superpower moment in the company is not going to be in their first 3 weeks or even 3 months. I would argue that when we take a company through YC, it's very similar. We know that that major insight they're going to have is probably not going to happen for a year. And it'll happen slower if they spend that entire year trying to build the perfect thing in their head. Don't talk to users, don't talk to customers, don't launch. It'll happen faster if they get stuff out there and see some of the assumptions they have in their head be proven wrong and start learning. Now, I think that like most successful founders hear me say this and like they think of their story when they look backwards as linear, right? Like, oh, it was just A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? And so like, obviously doing A poorly would screw up B, right? I just think that like you have to change your perspective when you're sitting at A and you don't actually know what B is. Like it's just a different. It's not a linear progression, and so I just think this debate's kind of it's silly because on the other hand, I would say it really also depends on the founder and what they're building. When Parker is building Rippling, okay, right? Well, a third-time founder who's rebuilding a business that they've already built once, should probably approach this differently than a 24-year-old who's building a business for the first time. Right? And so, I think that I run into this problem a lot at YC, where a founder will want every piece of advice to apply to them, and they'll want that piece of advice to apply at every stage of their company. And I'm like, wouldn't it be nice if advice were like laws of physics? But then I'm saying physics doesn't even work that way.
Totally.
Yeah, like that's not how the world works. Like, so sorry that like everything we say doesn't apply to your situation, and the thing we tell you to do this year won't work 3 years from now. Like, sorry.
It's also it may also be like if you're a company that does zero product, well, then like maybe launching quickly and getting users and learn, but let's say you're already like even a somewhat established. We had Amjad Masad, who's the CEO of Replit, on this podcast. They already have like a great product. They already have tons of users. And so, maybe the next product that they launch, maybe does have to have It has to be a little bit shinier. It can't be as half baked. It has to be more put together because the users have a certain expectation of what a Replit product would look like today. Whereas like when they launched, it maybe didn't have to have that.
Certainly, I would argue the rules for Amjad are going to be different than the rules for a founder who's 3 months in.
Yeah. And then of course, like Microsoft may have even the next, or whatever, another bar on there.
Yeah. So I think that I don't know. It's interesting. I actually think there's something else going on with this debate that's a little bit deeper. And I think the deeper thing isn't like, oh, your MVP has to be better. I think it's like market forces coming like at work. Pre this AI game, we hadn't really had a major platform shift since mobile. And so I think what a lot of young founders don't realize is that many ideas have been tried. And so I think you get this kind of thing that happens where it's like, they don't realize that this has been tried Yelp 2.0 has been tried 80 times.
Yes.
They release Yelp 2.0, no one uses it, and people are like, well, your MVP sucks. And it's kind of, is it your MVP sucks, or is it that the market doesn't want Yelp 2.0?
Yeah.
And like, you're just running the 81st like confirmation experiment on that. Or with the current tools that are available, you can't build a Yelp 2.0 that's sufficiently better. And you're the 81st company to experiment. And so I think that's actually what's really going on, is that behind the scenes, it's not like you can just build an Uber disruptor every like 2 years or a DoorDash disruptor every 2 years. Like that's really not how the game works. You need some environment or technology change to open the door to disrupt an incumbent. And if one doesn't exist, I don't care how good your MVP is, it ain't going to matter.
Is there some sort of sense of like, maybe somewhat of a bastardization of the classic Peter Thiel question that like where the founder sees the future that most smart people doesn't see? Everyone sees like, oh yeah, it'd be great if like we could build a better Salesforce.com. Like the UI is terrible and, it'd be awesome if we could, but is it something where they can see something and then and still most smart people completely disagree with them, but somehow they can still see it and they can then, or is that not as important? It's just kind of executing on something that like most people can see.
I think I don't have a good answer for you because I feel like I have success cases for both. And I think that not only do I have success cases for both, I actually think that the solution part isn't the part that people have trouble with. The more I work with founders, the more I realize that it is really hard to understand what problem a customer has and what their interest is in solving it. And, time and time again, I'll meet a company who says like, oh, well, we can save this enterprise $1 million a year. And they haven't really come to the realization that the enterprise might not give a shit about saving $1 million a year.
Yeah.
Or they say, oh, we can build this tool that's going to replace 50% of the people on your data team. And they might not come to the realization that the head of data doesn't want to fire 50% of the people on their data team. So I often feel as though the misunderstanding happens in the problem space. Everyone we fund can build software. And so like building good solutions is way more, that skill is way more distributed within the YC population. Understanding customer problems, that's actually really hard. Most people don't even want to engage with that intellectually. In the story of Twitch, right, it took us 5 years to understand that a subset of our users, gamers, wanted to make money. Nowadays, that sounds like the dumbest thing in the world because every social platform supports influencers and pays them out. Back then, influencers didn't exist. Like, there wasn't a thing. And so I remember, Emmett tells a story all the time where he was talking to streamers and he's like, you want us to give you a cut of your ad revenue? Like, that's going to be like $6 a month. And they're like, yes, I want that. I want $6 a month. and eventually we realized, oh shit, these people want to quit their jobs and do this full time.
Yeah.
And like, once we knew that, we could build the thing. Like building the things wasn't hard.
It
It
was
was
it
figuring.
was it was just it was being in enough repeated interactions to even come up with that,
Yes.
and
And
being open to it when you hear it, right?
yes,
Being
and
in the
being
right
open to
state.
think like, oh, maybe we can actually do that. Yeah, no. And I think what's so tricky is that for most of the history of Justin TV, we didn't talk to our users, and we didn't understand that knowing their motivations and what they cared about, like really caring for them, was an essential part of our job. Um, we thought building features was the most important of our part of our job, and oh, well, that requires people, well, that requires money, da da da. Like, that whole, building a bridge to nowhere kind of thing was what we were doing for the longest time.
There seems to be, like, if you think of like the companies that pivot, there seems to be kind of three types of companies. There's the companies that are like doing well, and then they don't need to pivot. They should just like focus more on what's going well.
Yep.
And then there's the companies who are like doing like it's just not going well, like don't have product market fit at all. And then, okay, well, that's clear that we should like do something radical because
Mhm.
we don't have product market fit. But you have all these companies that are kind of in the middle. They've got like something like, okay, it's not growing super fast. It's there. It's a business. If you start going on this new thing, that means you have the potential to kill this okay business because you're not
Yeah.
focused on it. Like, I imagine you have a lot of companies in that tweener stage. Like, how do you think about that?
Well, this reminds me of what we tell founders when they're fundraising. They always say, well, we have these people who said yes, these people who said no, and these are maybes. And we're like, the maybes are no's. Move forward. I would argue that tweener businesses are more often than not no's. And especially coming out of the last environment where there was so much cash around,
Yeah.
I've started to see this phenomenon where, I would argue that like most smart founders that apply themselves can get a business to $1 million in ARR. I'd argue if you give those people $25 to $50 million, they can probably get a not very good business to 10 million in ARR.
Yep.
That doesn't mean it's a good business. That doesn't mean it's profitable. That doesn't mean it could ever become a business that generates 100 million or a billion in revenue. It just means that like if you spend $1 enough, you can figure out how to extract 20 cents from it.
Yeah.
And I would argue that those businesses are not going to get product market fit, and they should not be furthered. They're in the category of businesses that should be, at the minimum milked, right? We could milk Justin TV because it was profitable. So we could milk the revenue from Justin TV to build Twitch. But if that like business that's not working is also burning capital,
then it's a problem. Yeah.
It's a big problem. Yeah. And people don't say that enough. I think people are afraid. I've had founders who are like, well, I know this thing isn't going to work, but if I don't grow 10% month over month, we're screwed. I'm like, you've just given me two scenarios where you're screwed. You probably need to stop growing this thing 10% month to month if you're absolutely convinced it's never going to work.
And like in the Twitch example, like you had something like Justin TV, which was like, okay,
yep.
It was there, but you knew it wasn't going to like it wasn't going to change, it wasn't going to become a massive outcome and stuff like that.
No.
And so how did you just be like, okay, we're going to put like two guys in maintenance mode over here and the rest of us are going to like, how did you like?
Well, I'll tell you how we did it. I think that we couldn't actually think clearly about Justin TV until we got it profitable. And we didn't get it profitable until I pitched 50 investors and they all said, fuck you. So, and until we had 2 months of runway. So it was like pitch a bunch of investors. They say, screw you. 2 months of runway. All right, let's make this thing profitable.
Or something.
Yeah, let's make this actually, like, we don't want to die. If we could just bottle up the motivation that founders have right when they're close to death and just give it to them all the time, game over. And I think that once we got into that clear era of profitability, so that would have been the end of, oh God, my dates are all screwed up now. Oof. Maybe end of 2010. Is that right? I don't know. Anyways, once we got there, then this great guy by the name of Gideon Yu came by our office. He was a partner at Coastal at the time, had no interest in investing in us. Zero. He thought our business sucked. It was absolutely correct. But for some reason, dropped this dime on us where he basically said, look, if you keep on doing what you're doing within the next 3 years, your revenue is going to slip. You're going to go unprofitable. No one's going to fund you and you're going to die. And no one's going to remember what you've done. That's it. Like that was,
Yeah.
that was all the advice. And
You're like,
because
shit, I better do something now.
yes. Well, and I'd argue that like because we were profitable, we could hear that and do something with it.
Yeah.
And what we did was we split the company into 3 groups. One group was maintenance for Justin TV, keeping the revenue flowing. One group started working on Justin TV gaming, which became Twitch. And one group started working on social cam. We set a goal where we wanted to have this much traction in one of the 2 businesses within 6 months of launching it, or we would kill the one that wasn't having traction. The story we like to tell is that both were doing well. And so we spun off one. The reality is that like Twitch was doing way better than social cam, but investors really like social cam. And we really like the idea of social cam, right? Instagram for video just seems like a home run idea.
Yeah.
And so why give it up? And so we actually ended up pursuing both. And I would argue that it was somewhat of a home run idea. Snapchat was made right at that time. And had we had better insights, we could have competed with them more effectively, but we did not.
Interesting. Yeah. In 2010, a similar scenario where this company, rapidly wasn't doing that great. It got it to profitability, but we had $16 million in the bank. So we did this pivot to LiveRamp, and I guess the pivot was easier because we had a relatively functioning base thing. We had $16 million in the bank. We had a good team of 30 people, mostly engineers. So
Yep.
It just made it easier to do a pivot than kind of a classic pivot would be to do.
Yeah. But we still got lucky. I mean, that shit didn't have to go that way.
Exactly. Now, one thing I think interesting about YC is that YC generally advocates equal splits for founders in the batch companies. So if you have 3 founders, they would get like the same shares each.
Yep.
Right. Why do you do that?
So I would say this goes back to the teams that we are historically seeing. So we're historically seeing a 3-founder team, all first-time founders, all kind of mid-20s to late 20s.
Yeah.
And probably last but not least, like none of them true experts in the field they're going after, right? Really smart, technically talented, but not, deep
so they're all
industry
like roughly
expertise.
at the same level.
Exactly.
One might be called CEO, but they're all roughly at the same level.
Exactly. And I think that because those are the scenarios that we see the most, we kind of give advice for those scenarios. I don't think equal equity splits work in all situations. One, if it's a 2-founder setup, I often recommend, some slight unequal. So there's some kind of like, one of the 2 founders is on the board, or one person has, 1% more, just to deal with if there's co-founder dispute. And then certainly there's different scenarios if, founders have various different levels of experience, da 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 da. But I would say that we like that advice for the teams that we mostly are seeing.
Yeah. Now, let's say Michael Seibel starts a company. You decide, I'm quitting YC, I'm starting a company, and you start it with a up-and-comer 24-year-old, the next Michael Seibel who you meet, and you're like, oh, obviously there would be some sort of equity imbalance because you have all this experience. You've started these super successful companies and stuff like that. Have you seen anything like that?
So I don't spend a lot of time thinking about those scenarios. I think that if I were to do that, the equity balance would come from me investing in the company.
Okay, got it.
Versus,
so it's like, okay, we have even equity, and then I'll put money in at a 5 pre or whatever.
Exactly.
And then, okay.
But I will say this, right? Being a non-technical founder and working with 2 amazing technical founders with Emmett and Kyle, Justin TV used to break every Saturday and Sunday morning. And we all would get SMSs. We'd all get the PagerDuty SMSs, like, video systems down, websites down. And like, I can't fix it.
Nothing you could do.
I can't, like, the only thing I could do is make sure that Emmett and Kyle are awake, getting
they get
the
their coffee and their donuts.
Yeah. And so I saw that so often where, like, I'm the CEO, sure, but like, if my partners are not incredibly motivated, then this shit ain't going to work. And giving people equity, I think everyone, I think a lot of the people who do a lot of unequal equity splits are business people like me, business guy. And they're like, oh, well, they only negotiated for this much. Or like, oh, well,
Yeah.
it was my idea or some shit like that. And I'm always just like, who is waking up in the middle of the night to fix this? The equity is going to wake them up, or you're going to
Yep.
wake them up. Like the equity does a way better job of waking them up. and
It's a
and
good
it's a
point.
mistake that people don't realize early. I always say, a level one CEO is thinking about, the next year. Oh, well, they're going to be perfectly happy with this equity split over the next year. A level two CEO is thinking like, well, this might take 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
How are they going to feel 5 years in? I should be making sure they're going to feel good about 5 years in, even if they don't think that way right now. It's my job to think that far out. So that's why I always like giving people more equity.
Now, a lot of what we're talking about are software related companies
Of
with
course,
bits,
only software. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which have really been what Silicon Valley's been very good at funding. But I've heard you say that it's not so good at funding things that are more atoms based or bio based or et cetera. Like, what's holding us back, and how do we change that?
I don't know that something's holding us back. I think that they're harder. I think not only are they harder, when you look at the examples of the people who have won, let's kind of like let's talk about three different types of businesses, right? Let's talk about lending businesses. Let's talk about hard tech businesses. Let's talk about bio businesses. I'd argue
Okay.
that like in lending businesses, it's like interesting that a firm started by someone who's incredibly wealthy, who can go and like raise debt based on their reputation and their personal balance sheet would have a massive advantage, right?
Right.
Very, very
Yeah.
interesting, right? Um, if you think about hard tech, it's interesting that Elon could go raise a bunch of money to build rockets, right? Like based on previous success. Very hopeful. When you look at bio, the entire bio VC ecosystem, for the most part, like invests a ton of money in early stage companies, buys way more ownership than the software
Yeah.
world, often replaces the
Kicks out the
management team.
founders.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. It's
Yeah.
like, so it's like, I think that, the software model is different, right? There aren't as many Mark Zuckerbergs in those other three worlds.
Yep.
And so,
Now there are these like mini YC. If you think of Bob Nelson, he's kind of a famous biotech investor. He's kind of like a mini YC in a way, or mini atomic, or kind of like
mhm,
starting a bunch of these things. And of course, we have accelerators there. Like Moderna came out of accelerator,
sure,
or an incubator. So there are these like other structural
I
types,
agree.
but the capital needs are very different for those companies.
Well, and the skill sets of the founders are
Yeah.
often, way more specialized. Like I would just argue it's harder. If you're doing a bio business, a hard tech business, or a lending business, it's harder.
Okay. Interesting. Now, how do you think of this, like, kind of insider or outsiders? Like, I think a lot of the well-known founders have kind of historically been outsiders, um, and and maybe that, and in the early days of YC, anyone who would join YC was probably somewhat of an outsider.
Yes.
But today, like, getting into YC is kind of like getting into McKinsey or Goldman Sachs or Google or something. It's like
Oh, oh,
there's a badge on your resume that everyone
sure.
is familiar with, right? So
There's
if
a
you say,
credential.
hey, even if your company didn't go well, if you say, hey, I got funded by YC, that's kind of like, it's like going to Stanford Business School or something
Yep.
or whatever. It's kind of thing that maybe an insider would want to do as well. How do you differentiate, or do you differentiate between these like outsider and insiders?
I would say this. I would say YC is often perceived as a better deal for outsiders. And I would say that YC was built for outsiders. And I think the core thesis of YC is that there are more outsiders. And so there is a bigger talent pool of outsiders than there are
Yeah.
insiders, and that there is less competition there. Um, all the VCs in the world are trying to go after former Facebook execs, top of the class, Stanford, CS kids, et cetera, et cetera. Much smaller pool, many more competitors. I would also say that outsiders more often than not have a chip on their shoulder. And that is very useful as a startup founder, to feel like you've been underestimated and to feel like you need to prove to, and this isn't healthy, but to feel like you need to prove to the world or yourself or your parents or someone that you're better than they think you are is extremely useful. And I would argue that like insiders sometimes have the same problems that like kids of rich parents have, which is like,
Yeah.
They've always been skating on in the easy lane. And so I think that what we have seen as YC has gotten bigger and the advantages of YC have gotten more clear is we see some insiders saying, wait a second, this 7% deal is better than it looks, And I think you start seeing this a lot with YC alums who come back, right? I did YC twice. Justin did it 4 times. Parker came back and did it. Kyle came back and did it. You start seeing this like, oh, wait, I'm an insider. But the thing that Brian Chesky told me when I was considering doing YC again was YC is a toolbox full of tools, and you know how to use the tools better than you did when you were 23.
Yeah.
And you can get way more out of them. And I was like, oh shit, you're right. Like, whereas I think a lot of people want to see YC as like a status thing. It's like, oh, it's like undergrad. I'm already past that. It's for young people. It's for first timers. It's like, no, in this way, it's not like a university. Like in this way, it's very different than a university. In this way, it's much more like a software company or like dev tools, where like a bad engineer can take some dev tools and, build something. And a great engineer can take some dev tools and build something much more amazing. And so I think that what's been interesting is to see the insiders kind of flip a little bit and say like, oh shit, this deal's better than it looks. But it was still designed and is still primarily for outsiders.
One of the things is like as YC itself evolves and becomes more of an institution, in some ways it's harder for somebody with an outsider personality to manage. I have this theory. The reason why Paul Graham left YC is that he wanted to remain a true outsider. And it would be hard to do it as like running, because you can't necessarily say whatever you want to say if you're running like an institution.
Sure.
And it gives you, you have a little bit more freedom if you're slightly on the outside or something like that. Like at some point, like these things become, if it's going to be 100-year institution, it's you have to watch a little bit what you say. You have to be a little more polite, right? Or no, you don't agree.
I don't think being for outsiders means that we have to say radical things. I think it has to do with our process for funding companies. Typical VC funds celebrate the idea that you need to have a warm referral to talk to them. What about everyone who's not 1 degree separated from someone who knows Roloff at Sequoia, right?
Yep.
It's easy to argue, oh, great, they should be excluded because they don't have the skills to do that networking. YC would argue, please continue excluding them. Like we would love to talk to them. But I would say that the thing that would make us not for outsiders is if somehow how we solicited applications, read applications and interviews changed. And that's something that stayed fairly consistent the entire, from PG's first batch to today. You don't have to know us. You just fill out an application. You don't have to build a deck. It's an experience that's a lot more like applying to a college and so is familiar and common to almost every smart person in the world.
What is last couple of questions? What is a conspiracy theory that you believe?
What's a conspiracy theory that I believe? I'll tell you one. It's not really a conspiracy theory. I think Doug at Sequoia let a big secret slip in a podcast once that I recorded and put onto YC's user manual because it was such an important secret. And he basically said, Sequoia can't help you if you're pre-product market fit. Like, it's your job to find product market fit. We can
Yeah.
help you with all the shit you have to do after that. But the product market fit's the black magic part. I think that my conspiracy theory is just, some version of investors are way less helpful than they appear or present. And founders deserve almost all of the credit because finding product market fit is so freaking hard. And like
Yeah.
no one who's like doing board meetings once a quarter is really contributing to that effort at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Totally.
know? Like this idea of like founding investors, it's like, sorry, no, like in many ways, especially in the early stages of companies, your investors are more like your lawyers. No one would give your lawyers credit for like figuring out the company.
Well, maybe in the scenario where you mentioned the Gideon U scenario where they could like scare you into finding something else or something.
Maybe, but like I would even argue like the thing Gideon said to us was obvious. We were
Yeah.
running a company that had mostly copywritten content. We were being sued, right? Like, it was like he wasn't giving us a secret. Like he was just holding a mirror to our faces and said, "This is what you are." Like,
Hilarious.
so, anyways, I think that you know, maybe my conspiracy theory is that like pre-product market fit, the value add investor doesn't. I don't want to say the value add investor doesn't exist. 90+% of the lift is giving product market fit, and the investor can't help you do it.
Yep. All right. Last question we ask all of our guests. What
Yep.
conventional wisdom or advice do you think is generally bad advice?
I used to think that everyone who had the skills to do a startup should do a startup. And I used to attempt to browbeat people into doing startups who obviously didn't want to. And I would do it even more for underrepresented populations. Like, oh man, like you could be doing this. Like you should be doing this. And I think it took me a long time to realize that this isn't, skills are important, but they aren't the actual real game here. Um, Everyone in the game's got skills. Anyone who's serious in the game has skills. There's a little bit of, you have to be broken. Like wanting pain and stress, like seeing life as more exciting when there's pain and stress is not rational. And so I think I've just come to this conclusion that there are, 1% or whatever of the population has this like weird thing that's broken about them. And they're inclined towards startups, and they probably should go acquire the skills so they can go do them. And
Yeah.
everyone else isn't. And they probably shouldn't do them. And I bet one day, we'll figure out what that thing is, and we'll see it as akin to, hey, most people who are 6'8" to 7 foot should think about basketball, right? And
Yeah.
most people who are 5'2" shouldn't. and I think that, there is this idea that everyone can be an entrepreneur. And like, sure, everyone should have the right or the freedom to be an entrepreneur. But I don't think everyone can process this amount of pain and disappointment and not only remain motivated, but like can use it to motivate themselves. And it's funny because on the team at YC, the people I work with, they always joke. They're like, you're waiting for bad things to happen. Like you want bad things to happen. You like when bad things happen. And I'm like, that's not wrong, and they always complain when it's like, well, you got good feedback on this and you're dismissing it. I'm like, yeah, I want the bad. Like that's what good feedback, that's useless. And I
And
think
probably
that
slight amendment, you're really talking about, you're not just talking about like being an entrepreneur, because probably lots of people will start like a little thing. It's more like being a high growth startup like kind
yes,
of person,
yes,
right?
yes,
It's which
yes,
is a very, very different animal than,
yes.
okay, I'm going to start a firm with 5 people and
Mm,
put my kids through college with it, which is great and admirable.
completely agree with you. I'm not talking about starting a small business. I'm saying trying to be an entrepreneur that builds one of the largest businesses, in a country or in the world. And I think that that's probably the piece of conventional wisdom that I got wrong. That I should be, instead of talking about how amazing this is and trying to convince people, I should be talking about how bad it is, and have people being like, "No, that sounds like
Select
fun."
out.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
they'd be like, "Oh, great! Like pain and suffering sounds like fun." We're of the same mind.
Well, there's also a certain class. There's a lot of people who have a desire to be successful, but there's a certain class of people who just would not have an extremely tough time being successful in the confines of an already existing institution. And they just don't have the personality to do that in the right way. And so those people are almost forced to do a startup, whereas somebody else who maybe has quite a good personality to be successful in the confines, maybe it doesn't actually ever make sense for that person to start a company.
When I talk to college kids, I make this exact point you made. I basically am like, it is rational to like a job at Google. You don't have to work very hard. You get laundry, you get food, you get like it is it is not bad to want that job. But if you think that sounds horrible, maybe this world's for you.
Yeah. This has been amazing. Thank you, Michael Seibel, for joining us at World of DaaS. I follow you at MW Seibel on Twitter. I definitely encourage our listeners to engage with you there. This has been a ton of fun.
Had a lot of fun. Thanks for the invite again.